Hi, and welcome back to STS 1451, Body, Mind, and Health. We're going to dive into our second major lecture today. We are firing on all cylinders, and you might be feeling a little bit overwhelmed. We're compressing a 15-week course into just 3 weeks. I've trimmed away all that I can, but we still have a lot to do. We're reading challenging secondary sources like the reading you had today. We're learning how to analyze primary sources for your first paper. We're discussing how illness affects us personally. And as I've said before, our lectures don't repeat our readings. They give us even more to think about. So I know that you're doing a lot. You might feel a little bit like you're in the Philadelphia physician factory, but there's a method to the madness. Paper 1 practices skills that you're going to need in your major paper, paper 2, and noticing how naming and framing illnesses changes over time will help you on both your papers and your final exam. So it's all going to come together. This week, the lectures are more intensive because we're just getting started. Next week, I'm going to back off a little bit as you spend more time independently working on your papers. There will still be supplementary materials, but it won't be quite as much. Our keywords, concepts, and names, we have fewer of them today, and I don't have a separate page for the ones from your reading. I've just made those bold here. Scientific medicine, which I've already mentioned a little bit. Correlation does not imply causation. Specificity, universalism, inoculation, cotton mather, and therapeutic. Therapeutic is also a word in our reading, so that one should be in bold, I suppose. Tracing the history of medicine. What might be wrong with this timeline? In 1590, the first microscope is invented. It can only magnify by 9 times. In 1850, Carl Zeiss improved lenses. In the 1870s, bacteriology becomes more prominent, and we have the birth of scientific medicine. The paradigm changes from specificity to universalism. That's something that's in your reading, so I'm not going to elaborate on it here, but you should have a good sense of what that means, and if you don't, you should talk to your TA. In 1877, Louis Pasteur notes that certain molds inhibit anthrax bacilli growth. And in 1922 to 23, penicillin is discovered by Clodomiro Twite in Costa Rica and Alexander Fleming in England around the same time. Thousands of lives have saved. So you're already probably guessing that it's a linear timeline, and I'm not going to like it. But another problem with that is that there's a logical fallacy. It implies that the correlation between having the microscope and the rise of scientific medicine is causation, like the microscope caused that change. But the microscope didn't do it alone. The microscope itself is not that interesting to us. What matters is how it became useful and accessible. A few scientists could have had microscopes in their own personal homes and collections, and that never would have changed medicine in general. So let's think about what actually made the microscope useful and how it contributed to, but didn't cause, scientific medicine. How did the microscope become useful and accessible? In 1893, this is a quote, my citation's down here, a physician in discussing diphtheria noted the difficulties of diagnosing the disease on purely clinical grounds and the harm that could come from a wrong diagnosis. Although the doctor claimed that science came to his aid, he also noted that only a few of our young members had the advantage of such training and special laboratory courses. So even after the microscope was invented, doctors didn't know how to use it, how to apply it to their field. That wasn't that useful then. The physician added that, quote, in New York, the Board of Health provided free of charge the appropriate laboratory tests. In 3 months, 431 cultures had been examined, of which 301 were positive. The author pleaded for widespread extension of such diagnostic facilities. So how does this report complicate the timeline that I already gave us? 1, it demonstrated that laboratory results had to be given without cost in order for the microscope to have its impact on public health. When it was free, then doctors could actually use it. 2, that means that we need the instrumentation, what we would call the technology, the actual microscope. We need the science of how to use it, how to isolate the germ. We're going to read about that tomorrow. And we need policy changes in order for scientific medicine to evolve as it did. Politics, science, technology, and culture are all pieces of the puzzle. So we can't really say that the microscope itself caused any massive change. There were a lot of different elements contributing to it. And what we do in the field of science and technology studies is look at how all of those elements work together. The politics of medical power. So now that you've read Warner, did you notice that he focuses on the treatment methods used by heroic doctors? I want to reserve most of the discussion of this text for your own reading, your work and your reflections and our small assignments. But look at the graph on page 91 or page 5 on the PDF, for example. Why do you think that he focuses on those techniques here? One reason is that he shows a gradual decline in those treatments. So he is talking about a change from specificity to universalism, but it wasn't this giant immediate paradigm shift that just came out of the blue, like we discovered bacteriology and all of a sudden we got rid of everything before. Heroic medical practices were already in decline. That's important. It shows gradual change that looks dramatic when we're looking at it in retrospect. Note that scientific knowledge or apparatuses were not available to everyone, and that some methods that we associate with scientific progress did not come about the way that we might imagine. Let's use vaccines as an example. Consider Cotton Mather, an account of the method and success of inoculating the smallpox in Boston and New England. So Cotton Mather, if you're not familiar with him, was a really famous preacher. He's really a famous puritanical figure of early America, and he is writing in 1722 here. A gentleman, Cotton Mather, well known in the city of Boston, had a Garamanti servant who first gave him an account of a method frequently used in Africa and which had been practiced on himself to procure an easy smallpox and perpetual security of neither dying by it nor being infected with it. If you've watched our video about reading hard text, you might notice that some of these words don't make sense the way that we speak today. An easy smallpox, we just have to gather from context that they mean you get smallpox, but it's minor, it's not going to kill you. And then perpetual security of neither dying by it nor being infected with it. That's what today we would call immunity. I noted here that Garamanti is a part of Africa. Those borders and designations have changed. So this is knowledge that came from Africa, though, which is important because we tend to think about, have a pretty Eurocentric or Western-centric view of medicine as if all of the discoveries are coming from America and the West, and that's actually not true. There's a lot of medical knowledge that's still in practice today that has come from many, many cultures. Afterwards, he, Cotton Mather, successively met with a number of Africans who agreed that it has now become a common thing to cut a place or two in their skin, sometimes one place, sometimes another, and put a little of the matter of smallpox, after which they in a few days grow a little sick and a few smallpox break out, and by they dry away, and that nobody ever died of doing this, nor ever had the smallpox after it, which last point is confirmed by their constant attendance on the sick in our families without receiving infection. So Cotton Mather basically noticed that their Black servants in New England were able to treat the white sick and dying, and they must know something that white Americans are. This is even, pre-Constitution, so white settlers didn't know yet, and he realized that they had this medical knowledge. Although inoculation was applied universally, this practice was developed by experts based on their interactions with patients and not their interactions with laboratories. So nowadays we think of vaccines as being born in the lab. We think about that kind of science as being a bastion of scientific medicine. We're talking about this now with COVID-19. We're going to watch about it next week when we learn about polio. But this information originally came from African servants. And yet that knowledge was not immediately useful to everybody. Professor Elizabeth A. Fenn discussed how the great smallpox epidemic nearly undermined the American Revolution. That's a book you could look up if you're interested. There were dissenting opinions too, so the idea of anti-vaxxing is not new to our current culture. This is a primary source. Poisoning and spreading infection are by the penal laws of England felony. And remember, the US is a colony of England, so when he says the penal law of England, that's what applies in the US too. Inoculation falls in with the first without any contradiction, and if a person of so weak a constitution that any illness may prove fatal to him should be inoculated and suffer but the 10th part of what several of the inoculated have done, he must unavoidably perish and his inoculator deemed guilty of poisoning. So this is a perspective that instead of looking at the spread of immunity, is afraid of sharing that poison and sees it as an actual crime according to their penal code. At every point in history, including today, there are so many different opinions circulating. How can we, as analysts or practitioners, if you eventually become a medical practitioner, or patients, which is something you will be at some point in your life, measure all of these different perspectives against each other? Part of my descent of linear narratives of progress follows from the fact that it's nearly impossible to determine the winner until years later. So people who seemed scientific and genius in the moment, way in retrospect, might look to us like quacks. But we have to think about why they seem to have expertise in their time period, because it tells us a lot about how people came to understand and agree upon what constitutes a fact. As STS scholars, we should try our best to withhold judgment and to be clear about context, rhetoric, and power dynamics, who benefits and why. That does not mean that all opinions have the same weight. This isn't just relativism. It does mean that we should pay attention to our own confirmation bias and try to understand what makes us agree that something is a fact. Even if we're convinced, understanding how we came to be convinced is useful. So if you trust that taking Tylenol is good for a headache, how did you come to be convinced of that? Did your parent give it to you once, or a doctor? Did you trust their authority? Did you try it yourself first and see if it worked for you? Did you have empirical knowledge? There are a lot of different ways that we can become convinced of things, and we're going to be looking to question those assumptions in ourselves, not to prove ourselves wrong, but just to understand it. And we're going to be studying those sorts of consensus building activities in the past too. For later or next time, we have another very difficult reading next class. Give yourself time to read and reread it, and maybe even reread the Warner from today. Warner and Cunningham are two of our major theoretical texts, so it's really important that you understand both of them in order to get through the class. Please let your TA or I know if you're having any questions, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow.